Welcome, traveller, to Medieval Screen Finds, a quiet corner of the internet where we explore history, a chill space where the echoes of the past gently guide you toward a restful calm. Tonight, we journey back to an age when the world seemed vast and untamed, an era when the rhythmic sigh of the ocean held both the promise of distant shores and the whisper of profound, often unseen perils. Allow your thoughts to settle and your breath to deepen as we contemplate the lives of those who dared to venture onto the medieval seas, a world far removed from our own comfortable harbours. Imagine, if you will, the gentle sway of a ship beneath a starlit sky, the scent of salt on the breeze, and the endless horizon stretching before you. This is a journey not of grand battles or dramatic discoveries, but of quiet endurance, of humble vessels, and of the persistent, often silent dangers that shape the very fabric of medieval maritime life. We will explore these challenges not to stir unease, but to offer a deeper understanding of the past, a tranquil exploration of human resilience against the vast, indifferent power of the sea. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to get more boring sleep videos, but only if these videos bring you rest. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's comforting seeing all the places where these calm historical stories reach. In the medieval world, the vessel itself was often the first and perhaps most fundamental vulnerability. These were not the leviathans of later ages, designed with complex internal structures and advanced engineering. No, the ships that plied the medieval waters, the sturdy cogs of the North Sea, the agile dromons of the Byzantine Empire, or the slender galleys that moved with the synchronized pull of oarsmen across the Mediterranean, were, by our modern understanding, remarkably primitive. Imagine yourself standing upon the deck of one such ship, a merchant cog, perhaps, bound for a distant port. Feel the rough-hewn timbers beneath your feet. Look out across the expanse of the deck. It is often startlingly open, exposed to the sky, to the biting wind, and to the relentless spray of the waves. These ships were, by necessity, relatively small. A typical cog, the workhorse of northern European trade, might be no more than 60 to 80 feet in length, perhaps 20 to 30 feet at its widest beam. Compare this to the vast ocean liners or even modern cargo ships of today, which measure hundreds of feet, sometimes more than 1,000. This inherent smallness meant that medieval vessels possessed limited internal volume, restricting the cargo they could carry, the provisions they could store, and, crucially, the space available for passengers and crew. More significantly, their diminutive size rendered them inherently susceptible to the whims of the ocean. A swell that a modern vessel would barely notice could lift a medieval cog high upon its crest, only to drop it into a deep trough with a sickening lurch, the timbers groaning under the strain. There was often little advanced bracing within their wooden frames, meaning that the structural integrity relied heavily on the sheer thickness of the planks and the strength of the natural curves of the wood. When confronted with the raw power of a tempest, these designs offered a fragile defense, easily overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water washing over the open decks. Water could cascade across the entire length of the ship, threatening to sweep men and cargo overboard, or to fill the hold, creating a constant, exhausting battle against the encroaching sea. The construction materials themselves, while robust for their time, presented their own persistent challenges. Medieval ships were built almost entirely from wood, oak, pine, elm, sourced from vast forests. These timbers were shaped, often by hand, and fitted together with remarkable skill. But wood is, by its very nature, organic and perishable. The planks were typically joined using techniques like clinker building, where overlapping strakes were riveted together, or carvel building, where planks were laid edge to edge. While these methods created strong hulls, they were never perfectly watertight. Tar, a thick, dark substance derived from pine resin, was smeared generously into the seams and over the hull to help repel water. Its distinct, pungent aroma a constant companion for those on board. Yet, despite these efforts, leaks were an almost inevitable part of any significant voyage. A persistent drip, a slow seep, or even a sudden gush could emerge from anywhere along the hull, demanding constant attention. Sailors would have to locate the source, often in the dark, cramped confines of the lower decks, and attempt to plug the breach with whatever materials were at hand: oakum, rags, or even their own clothing. These minor leaks, if left unchecked, could steadily accumulate, filling the bilges and threatening to destabilize the vessel. Rope, fashioned from hemp or animal fibers, was another essential, yet inherently vulnerable material. It formed the intricate network of lines that controlled the sails, secured the masts, and held the rigging in place. But rope chafes. It stretches. It weakens when wet and can become brittle in the sun. The constant friction of wind and waves against the rigging, the immense strain placed upon the lines during a gale, meant that a sailor's life was an ongoing struggle against wear and tear. A frayed line could snap without warning, sending a sail flapping uncontrollably, or a spar crashing down onto the deck. Imagine the sudden, violent crack of a heavy rope parting, the immediate scramble to control the flapping canvas, the urgent shouts over the roar of the wind. Such events, though not immediately catastrophic, could quickly escalate, especially if the ship was already battling adverse conditions. Beyond the fundamental structural limitations, medieval mariners operated under a stark absence of what we consider basic navigational aids. The very concept of accurate charts as we know them was nascent, if not entirely absent. Mariners relied on portolan charts, practical coastal maps that detailed harbours and coastlines, but offered little in the way of accurate longitudes or detailed oceanic features. They were guides for coastal hopping, not for crossing vast open expanses. The compass, though known in parts of Europe from the 12th century onwards, was often a rudimentary device, perhaps a magnetized needle floating in a bowl of water, subject to magnetic deviation and easily disturbed by the ship's motion. Its use was not universal, nor was its accuracy consistently relied upon for precise offshore navigation. Reliable timekeeping was another profound deficiency. Without accurate chronometers, determining longitude at sea was virtually impossible. This meant that navigators largely relied on dead reckoning, estimating their position based on their last known location, their speed, and the direction they had sailed. This was a process prone to cumulative error, especially in unpredictable weather or strong currents. They would measure speed using a chip log, a piece of wood attached to a knotted rope thrown overboard, counting the knots that passed over a set time. This gave them an approximate speed, but even this was an estimation. For determining latitude, sailors would often use instruments like the astrolabe or the simpler quadrant to measure the height of the sun at noon, or the pole star at night. This provided a line of latitude, but often only when the sky was clear enough to see the celestial bodies. Imagine the frustration and anxiety of a seasoned mariner, peering through a starless, overcast sky, knowing that his position was becoming increasingly uncertain with every passing hour. When visibility was poor, or when far from familiar coastlines, the navigator was, in essence, operating in a vast, featureless void, relying on intuition, experience, and often sheer luck. They would hug coastlines where possible, identifying familiar landmarks, but when driven offshore by storms or venturing into truly unknown waters, they were navigating by a perilous combination of guesswork and faith. The isolation of a ship at sea in the Middle Ages meant that limited repair capabilities were a constant shadow. Unlike modern vessels equipped with workshops, spare parts, and highly trained engineers, a medieval ship possessed only what could be carried on board by its crew. Major structural damage, such as a cracked mast, a breached hull, or a rudder carried away by a heavy sea, often spelled doom. There was simply no way to effect substantial repairs in the heaving, unpredictable environment of the open ocean. A minor leak, as discussed, could be addressed with rags and quick patching, but a significant inflow of water would demand ceaseless bailing, an exhausting and often futile effort performed by hand, bucket, by agonizing bucket. The pumps, if present, were simple wooden affairs, easily clogged and difficult to maintain. Imagine the grim scene. The ship's master, grim-faced, surveying the splintered remains of a mast or the gaping wound in the hull. There would be no distant port to limp into, no rescue tug to call, no skilled craftsman waiting. The crew, relying on their own ingenuity and brute strength, might attempt a makeshift repair, perhaps lashing a broken spar together with spare rope. But these were often temporary measures, desperate efforts against an overwhelming foe. Such damage often transformed a challenging voyage into a fight for survival, turning minor incidents into catastrophic failures, leaving the crew with little choice but to pray for calm seas and hope for the distant sight of land. Perhaps one of the most terrifying and ever-present dangers aboard a wooden ship in the Middle Ages was the constant threat of fire. Picture the conditions below deck. Dim light cast by flickering oil lamps or tallow candles, their flames dancing precariously in the humid air. In the galley, a simple hearth, perhaps a stone-lined box filled with sand, would house a roaring fire for cooking, the smoke rising into the cramped space. Surrounding these flames were countless flammable materials, dry timbers, pitch-soaked ropes, bales of highly combustible cargo like wool or dried foodstuffs. A single spark, a carelessly knocked-over lamp, a cooking fire that raged out of control, or even a lightning strike during a thunderous storm could ignite the entire vessel in a matter of minutes. Fire spreads with terrifying speed across dry wood, fueled by the fresh sea air rushing through the open decks and hatches. There were no elaborate firefighting systems, no hoses, no pressurized water, no chemical retardants. The only defense was the desperate, often futile effort to smother the flames with sand, buckets of seawater, or wet blankets. Imagine the horror, the sudden, acrid smell of burning wood, the shouts of alarm, the rush of men trying to contain the spreading inferno. The smoke would quickly fill the enclosed spaces, blinding and choking, while the heat would become unbearable. With nowhere to run, and the vast, cold ocean as the only escape, a fire at sea was almost always a death sentence. It transformed the ship, which was meant to be a sanctuary, into a burning coffin, leaving passengers and crew with a terrible choice: burn or drown. The memory of such a disaster, or the constant anxiety that it might occur, was a silent, persistent burden carried by all who sailed on these primitive wooden vessels. These inherent vulnerabilities of the medieval ship, its small size and open decks, the perishable nature of its construction materials, the absence of accurate navigation, the impossibility of major repairs, and the ever-present shadow of fire, all combined to make every voyage a testament to human courage and resilience. The very vessel meant to carry them safely across the waves was, at its core, a fragile creation, constantly battling against its own limitations and the relentless forces of the natural world. The medieval mariner, having entrusted his life to a fragile wooden shell, then faced the vast, indifferent power of the sea itself. This was not merely a passive expanse of water, but a living, breathing entity, capable of immense beauty and terrifying wrath. For these primitive vessels, the natural hazards of the ocean were not merely inconveniences, they were existential threats. far more impactful on their limited capabilities. Imagine, if you will, the sudden shift in the wind, a growing chill in the air, and the distant, ominous rumble that signals the approach of a violent storm. On a small medieval ship, a gale, even one that would be considered moderate by modern standards, could transform the voyage into a desperate struggle for survival. The sheer power of the waves, rising into towering walls of water, would lift the ship impossibly high, only to plunge it into deep, churning troughs. The vessel would become a toy, tossed and buffeted, its timbers groaning and shrieking under the unimaginable strain. The risk of capsizing was ever present. A sudden, rogue wave striking broadside could overwhelm the small, open decks, sending the ship rolling violently, threatening to turn it completely over. Even if it righted itself, the force of the water washing over the vessel could tear at the rigging, rip sails from their masts, or even break the mast itself. Imagine the deafening crack of a thick wooden mast, snapping, splintering under the immense pressure of the wind, collapsing onto the deck in a tangle of rope and timber. This was not merely a setback. It often rendered the ship unmanageable, leaving it at the mercy of the tempest, drifting helplessly. Being blown far off course was another insidious danger of these violent storms. Without accurate navigation, every hour spent battling a gale that pushed the ship away from its intended heading meant venturing further into the unknown, increasing the risk of running out of provisions or encountering even more treacherous waters. The psychological toll of continuous, violent motion was profound. Seasickness, unrelenting and debilitating, would afflict nearly everyone on board. Sleep would become impossible, replaced by a constant, exhausting struggle to maintain balance, to avoid being thrown across the deck, or to simply endure the wrenching nausea. The ceaseless roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, the relentless pitching and rolling would grind away at the spirit, fostering a deep weariness that bordered on despair. Beneath the deceptively calm surface of the water, another silent, ever-present menace lurked, hidden reefs and shoals. These were the ship killers, the jagged teeth of the ocean waiting to tear open a wooden hull. Near coasts or in unfamiliar archipelagos, where accurate charts were non-existent, ships would often navigate by sight, relying on the crew's vigilance and knowledge of the local waters. But what happened when dense fog descended, or when a storm pushed the ship off course into waters never before seen? The risk of striking an uncharted underwater obstacle soared. Imagine the sudden, sickening jolt, the shudder that would run through the entire vessel as its keel scraped against rock, followed by the terrifying sound of splintering wood as the hull was breached. In an instant, the gentle sway of the ocean could transform into a death trap. Water would rush in, cold and relentless, filling the hold. Shipwrecks, often violent and swift, were a common end for medieval voyages. A ship striking a reef rarely remained intact for long, breaking apart under the relentless assault of the waves, scattering its cargo and its human occupants into the churning sea. The thought of such an unseen danger, lurking just beneath the surface, must have been a constant, chilling undercurrent to every journey. Fog and low visibility were another profound challenge for medieval mariners. Imagine sailing into a thick, swirling mist, so dense that the bow of your own ship disappears from view, and the horizon vanishes entirely. All sense of direction, all familiar landmarks, are instantly obliterated. In such conditions, the rudimentary navigational tools available to them became almost useless. The sun or stars, their primary celestial guides, would be completely obscured. Sound would become distorted, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. Dense fog could completely disorient sailors, making navigation impossible. A ship might sail in circles for hours or drift helplessly, unaware of its true course. The risk of collisions with other vessels, unseen until the last terrifying moment, or of running aground on an unseen coastline or shoal, increased dramatically. The oppressive silence of a fog bank, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls or the distant lapping of waves against the hull, would amplify the sense of isolation and vulnerability. Every creak of the ship, every splash of water would be magnified, the sounds of a world hidden from view, a world that held both peril and uncertainty. The ocean's invisible forces, the currents and tides, also posed unpredictable dangers. While predictable in large-scale patterns, local currents could be powerful and deceptive, pushing ships into danger zones or hindering their progress against the wind. A strong current, particularly when combined with an adverse wind, could prevent a ship from reaching its intended harbour, or worse, drive it onto a lee shore, a coastline toward which the wind is blowing, making it almost impossible to sail away. Tides, especially in areas with significant tidal ranges, could leave a ship stranded on a sandbar at low water, vulnerable to attack or to breaking apart as the tide receded. Imagine the frustration and mounting fear as a ship struggles against an unseen force, losing ground, slowly being pushed closer to a perilous coast or out into the vast open sea, far from any familiar shipping lane. Finally, the sheer environmental extremes presented another, often overlooked, layer of danger. Imagine the chilling, penetrating cold of the North Atlantic in winter, where icy winds whipped across the decks and spray froze solid on the rigging. The constant dampness and low temperatures made hypothermia a serious threat, slowly sapping the strength and vitality from the crew. Frozen hands struggled to manipulate stiff ropes, and numb fingers lost their grip. The bitter cold permeated every part of the vessel, making rest and recovery almost impossible. Conversely, imagine sailing the warm, equatorial waters of the Mediterranean or the southern Atlantic in the heat of summer. Here, the sun beat down relentlessly, baking the decks and raising the temperature in the enclosed spaces below. Dehydration became a silent, insidious killer. With limited fresh water supplies, carefully rationed, and often stagnant after weeks at sea, the risk of thirst and its debilitating effects was ever present. The sun could also cause heat stroke, particularly among those toiling on deck under the relentless glare. The human body, exposed to these extremes without adequate protection or sustenance, would slowly succumb, leaving individuals weakened, susceptible to illness, and unable to perform their duties effectively. These natural elements, the violent storms, the unseen reefs, the disorienting fog, the relentless currents, and the punishing temperatures, were constant reminders of the ocean's raw, untamed power. For the medieval mariner, every wave held the potential for disaster, every shift in the wind a harbinger of unforeseen challenges. They sailed not just on the water, but within the very embrace of its untamed nature, a world where human ingenuity was often dwarfed by the sheer scale of the environment. But what happened when dense fog descended, or when a storm pushed the ship off course into waters never before seen? The risk of striking an uncharted underwater obstacle soared. Imagine the sudden, sickening jolt, the shudder that would run through the entire vessel as its keel scraped against rock, followed by the terrifying sound of splintering wood as the hull was breached. In an instant, the gentle sway of the ocean could transform into a death trap. Water would rush in, cold and relentless, filling the hold. Shipwrecks, often violent and swift, were a common end for medieval voyages. A ship striking a reef rarely remained intact for long, breaking apart under the relentless assault of the waves, scattering its cargo and its human occupants into the churning sea. The thought of such an unseen danger, lurking just beneath the surface, must have been a constant, chilling undercurrent to every journey. Fog and low visibility were another profound challenge for medieval mariners. Imagine sailing into a thick, swirling mist, so dense that the bow of your own ship disappears from view, and the horizon vanishes entirely. All sense of direction, all familiar landmarks, are instantly obliterated. In such conditions, the rudimentary navigational tools available to them became almost useless. The sun or stars, their primary celestial guides, would be completely obscured. Sound would become distorted, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. Dense fog could completely disorient sailors, making navigation impossible. A ship might sail in circles for hours or drift helplessly, unaware of its true course. The risk of collisions with other vessels, unseen until the last terrifying moment, or of running aground on an unseen coastline or shoal, increased dramatically. The oppressive silence of a fog bank, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls or the distant lapping of waves against the hull, would amplify the sense of isolation and vulnerability. Every creak of the ship, every splash of water, would be magnified, the sounds of a world hidden from view, a world that held both peril and uncertainty. The ocean's invisible forces, the currents and tides, also posed unpredictable dangers. While predictable in large-scale patterns, local currents could be powerful and deceptive, pushing ships into danger zones or hindering their progress against the wind. A strong current, particularly when combined with an adverse wind, could prevent a ship from reaching its intended harbour, or worse, drive it onto a lee shore, a coastline toward which the wind is blowing, making it almost impossible to sail away. Tides, especially in areas with significant tidal ranges, could leave a ship stranded on a sandbar at low water, vulnerable to attack or to breaking apart as the tide receded. Imagine the frustration and mounting fear as a ship struggles against an unseen force, losing ground, slowly being pushed closer to a perilous coast or out into the vast open sea, far from any familiar shipping lane. Finally, the sheer environmental extremes presented another, often overlooked, layer of danger. Imagine the chilling, penetrating cold of the North Atlantic in winter, where icy winds whipped across the decks and spray froze solid on the rigging. The constant dampness and low temperatures made hypothermia a serious threat, slowly sapping the strength and vitality from the crew. Frozen hands struggled to manipulate stiff ropes, and numb fingers lost their grip. The bitter cold permeated every part of the vessel, making rest and recovery almost impossible. Conversely, imagine sailing the warm, equatorial waters of the Mediterranean or the southern Atlantic in the heat of summer. Here, the sun beat down relentlessly, baking the decks and raising the temperature in the enclosed spaces below. Dehydration became a silent, insidious killer. With limited fresh water supplies, carefully rationed, and often stagnant after weeks at sea, the risk of thirst and its debilitating effects was ever present. The sun could also cause heat stroke, particularly among those toiling on deck under the relentless glare. The human body, exposed to these extremes without adequate protection or sustenance, would slowly succumb, leaving individuals weakened, susceptible to illness, and unable to perform their duties effectively. These natural elements, the violent storms, the unseen reefs, the disorienting fog, the relentless currents, and the punishing temperatures, were constant reminders of the ocean's raw, untamed power. For the medieval mariner, every wave held the potential for disaster, every shift in the wind a harbinger of unforeseen challenges. They sailed not just on the water, but within the very embrace of its untamed nature, a world where human ingenuity was often dwarfed by the sheer scale of the environment. Beyond the direct perils of the sea and the inherent vulnerabilities of the ship itself, another set of dangers lurked, insidious and often invisible until it was too late. The slow, relentless erosion of health, the gnawing discomfort of hunger, and the agonizing torment of thirst. These were the silent killers, often more pervasive and widespread in their impact than any storm or pirate attack, slowly debilitating and ultimately claiming lives aboard medieval vessels. Consider the pervasive and dreaded spectre of scurvy. For those embarking on long voyages, particularly across vast oceanic expanses where land was not sighted for weeks or months, the onset of scurvy was an almost inevitable consequence of their diet. The medieval diet at sea was, by necessity, incredibly limited and utterly devoid of fresh fruits and vegetables. Provisions typically consisted of hardtack, a type of dry, unleavened biscuit, often infested with weevils, salted or dried meat or fish, cheese, and perhaps some dried beans or peas. While these provided caloric sustenance, they completely lacked vitamin C. The initial symptoms of scurvy would be subtle: a general fatigue, a lack of energy, and perhaps some irritability. But as the deficiency deepened, the effects would become progressively more debilitating and horrifying. Gums would swell and bleed, becoming spongy and black, causing teeth to loosen and eventually fall out. Old wounds, long healed, would painfully reopen, weeping and refusing to close. Skin would become sallow and bruised, covered in dark spots and blotches. The limbs would swell, often becoming agonizingly painful, making movement excruciating. Joints would ache, and muscles would waste away. Eventually, the heart would weaken, leading to breathlessness and ultimately death. Imagine a crew slowly succumbing to this dreadful affliction. One by one, strong, capable men would be transformed into pallid, moaning figures, their bodies decaying even as they remained alive. The psychological impact on those who witnessed this slow, inevitable decline, knowing they too might soon follow, must have been profound. There was no known cure, no understanding of its cause. Sailors could only watch, helpless, as their shipmates wasted away. Their suffering a grim testament to the invisible enemy within their very bodies. Compounding the problem of malnutrition was the constant challenge of contaminated water and food. Fresh water was perhaps the most precious commodity on any voyage. It was typically stored in wooden casks, which were difficult to keep clean and often harbored algae, bacteria, and other impurities. After just a few weeks at sea, the water would become stagnant, foul-smelling, and often slimy to the touch. Drinking it was a necessity, but it carried the risk of severe gastrointestinal distress. Imagine the taste, the smell, the effort required to force down even a sip of this tepid, putrid water, knowing that it might bring on wrenching stomach cramps and violent diarrhea. Such waterborne illnesses, particularly dysentery, could sweep through a ship with terrifying speed. With no effective treatments, severe dehydration from persistent vomiting and diarrhea could quickly lead to death. The latrines, if they existed at all, were usually simple arrangements over the side of the ship, meaning waste often contaminated the very water that was drawn for washing, or even, indirectly, for drinking. Food preservation was equally rudimentary. Salted meats and dried fish were prone to spoilage, especially in warmer climates. Weevils, maggots, and rats were common inhabitants of the food stores, contaminating provisions and further undermining the health of those who consumed them. Even if food didn't overtly spoil, its nutritional value would degrade over time. The constant struggle to find sustenance that was both edible and not actively harmful was a daily battle, often lost. The very design of medieval ships, with their crowding and poor hygiene, created ideal breeding grounds for disease. Passengers and crew alike were packed into tight, often unventilated spaces below deck. There was little concept of personal hygiene beyond perhaps a quick wash with seawater, if that. Fresh clothing was scarce, and lice, fleas, and other vermin were ubiquitous companions. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stagnant water, human waste, and stale provisions. These cramped, unsanitary conditions were perfect incubators for the rapid spread of infectious diseases. A single sick individual could quickly infect dozens of others. Typhus, spread by body lice, could sweep through a ship like wildfire, inducing high fevers, delirium, and often death. Smallpox, measles, and other highly contagious ailments, often brought from crowded ports, would find fertile ground in the confined quarters, with no means of isolation or prevention. Imagine the terror of seeing a shipmate break out in the telltale pox, knowing that your own close proximity made infection almost inevitable. Coughs, sneezes, and shared living spaces ensured that airborne pathogens could spread unchecked. The ship became a floating petri dish, its inhabitants helpless against the unseen microbial armies. The most tragic aspect of these health crises was the almost complete lack of medical care. Medieval medicine on land was rudimentary at best, relying on a mix of herbal remedies, bloodletting, and often superstitious practices. At sea, even these limited resources were often unavailable. A ship might carry a barber surgeon, trained in basic first aid, setting bones, and perhaps amputations, but this was a rarity for most merchant vessels. For the vast majority of sick or injured individuals, there was simply no effective treatment. A high fever, a severe infection, a complicated fracture, any of these could quickly become a death sentence. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no sterile instruments. A simple cut could turn gangrenous, leading to a slow, agonizing death. Imagine the desperate cries of a man racked with fever, the futile efforts to cool his brow with a damp cloth, the helpless watching as he slipped further away. The only recourse was often prayer, and the grim reality of tossing bodies overboard, a quiet, almost daily ritual on particularly afflicted voyages. Finally, the most immediate and terrifying threat, often intertwined with the other dangers, was the constant shadow of dehydration. While contaminated water was a concern, simply running out of water was an even more immediate and agonizing peril. This was especially true if a voyage extended beyond its planned duration due to adverse weather, being blown far off course by storms, or becalmed for days or weeks in windless seas. As water supplies dwindled, rationing would begin, each sip a precious, agonizing drop. The thirst would become an overwhelming, burning torment, drying the mouth, cracking the lips, and parching the throat. The body would begin to shut down, leading to dizziness, confusion, and eventually, organ failure. Imagine the desperate prayers for rain, the frantic searches for any source of moisture, the agony of seeing the water casks empty, knowing that every passing hour brought a closer embrace with a slow, tormenting death. The taste of salt in the air, a constant reminder of the undrinkable vastness that surrounded them, would only amplify the torment. These were the silent struggles of medieval sea travel, the unseen enemies of disease, the constant gnawing of hunger, and the agonizing burn of thirst. They were not as dramatic as a raging storm, nor as immediate as a pirate attack. But their toll was often far greater, slowly and systematically breaking down the human spirit and body, a grim testament to the harsh realities of life on the medieval waves. While the natural world presented an unending series of challenges, the medieval seas were also fraught with dangers born of human nature itself. From opportunistic raiders to organized fleets, the threat of piracy and other human threats was a constant, tangible fear, forcing mariners and merchants to balance vigilance with the hope of an unmolested passage. The most pervasive of these human perils was the almost ubiquitous presence of piracy. It was not a rare occurrence, but a widespread and deeply ingrained feature of medieval maritime life across all major shipping lanes. Whether in the relatively confined waters of the Mediterranean, where North African corsairs and Christian pirates preyed on shipping, or in the tumultuous North Sea and along the Atlantic coasts, where Norse raiders, Frisian pirates, and later, more organized groups sought plunder, no ship was truly safe. These were not always grand fleets or legendary figures. Often, piracy began with small, local opportunists, fishermen or coastal dwellers who saw an easy mark in a passing merchant vessel, especially one becalmed or struggling in rough weather. They operated from hidden coves and secluded islands, striking swiftly and vanishing back into the labyrinthine coastlines. However, piracy also evolved into something more organized. Powerful coastal lords, disaffected knights, or even desperate communities might sponsor or engage in acts of piracy, blurring the lines between legitimate trade, privateering, and outright banditry. Imagine the nervous anticipation as a ship approached a known choke point or narrow strait where the risk of ambush was highest. Every sail on the horizon, every unfamiliar vessel, would be scrutinized with a mixture of hope and dread. The primary motivation for pirates was, predictably, cargo and captives. Merchant ships, laden with valuable goods, spices from the east, rich textiles, precious metals, timber, grain, or wine, represented a tempting prize. The sudden appearance of a pirate vessel, often smaller and swifter, designed for pursuit and boarding, would trigger a desperate scramble. If resistance was offered, battles could be swift and brutal, fought with swords, axes, and bows. But often, if the pirates significantly outnumbered the merchant crew, resistance might be futile. The cargo would be plundered, and the ship itself might be taken as prize, or simply looted and then set adrift, or even sunk. Beyond the material wealth, captives were a significant prize, particularly in the Mediterranean. Individuals, whether merchants, pilgrims, or ordinary travelers, could be seized for ransom, their families or communities forced to pay exorbitant sums for their release. If ransom was not forthcoming, captives, especially those from rival faiths or distant lands, faced the grim prospect of sale into slavery. Imagine the horror of being dragged from your ship, bound and transported to a foreign land, facing an uncertain future of forced labor or perpetual servitude, forever separated from all that was familiar. The loss of freedom, the breaking of family ties, was a profound and devastating consequence of pirate raids. The seas were not only home to independent pirates, but also saw the dangers of naval warfare and privateers. During times of conflict between kingdoms, official naval engagements, though less frequent for merchant vessels, certainly posed a threat. A merchant ship might inadvertently sail into a battle zone or be seized as a prize by a warring faction. Even more common was the threat of privateers, privately owned vessels granted a commission or letters of marque by a sovereign power to attack and capture enemy shipping. While ostensibly legitimate acts of war, the line between privateering and outright piracy was often exceedingly thin, especially from the perspective of the unfortunate victims. A ship carrying goods for an enemy nation, or even a neutral ship suspected of aiding the enemy, could find itself legally plundered, its crew imprisoned, and its cargo seized, all under the guise of state-sanctioned activity. Even within the confines of a single vessel, human nature could present its own dangers. While less common than external threats, the possibility of mutiny and internal strife always lingered. A desperate, overworked, or disgruntled crew, pushed to their limits by harsh conditions, dwindling food, tyrannical leadership, or simply sheer despair, might turn on their officers. Imagine the tense atmosphere, the hushed whispers, the growing resentment that could erupt into open rebellion, leading to violence, imprisonment, or even the summary execution of those in command. Similarly, conflicts could arise between passengers, especially when confined in close quarters for extended periods, their patience worn thin by discomfort, fear, or dwindling provisions. A disagreement over space, food, or religious differences could escalate into physical violence, further destabilizing an already vulnerable situation. Finally, a grim reality of maritime life was the practice of shipwreck scavenging. While shipwrecks were tragic events for those aboard, they represented an unexpected boon for coastal communities. The custom, and sometimes even the legal right, of salvaging goods from a wrecked ship was widespread. However, this often devolved into outright plunder. Imagine a ship, battered by a storm, driven onto rocks near a populated shore. Instead of immediate aid, the desperate crew and passengers might witness local villagers descending upon the wreck like vultures, seizing cargo, tearing apart the vessel for its timber, and even, in the most horrific instances, actively preventing survivors from reaching safety or preying upon those who did. There are even chilling tales and historical accounts of wreckers, individuals or groups who would intentionally lure ships to their doom by extinguishing coastal lights, placing false beacons, or removing navigational markers, all for the sole purpose of plundering the inevitable wreck. This added an even darker layer to the perils of the sea, knowing that even if one survived the wrath of the ocean, the greed of fellow humans could still seal one's fate. These human threats, from the ubiquitous pirate to the treacherous wrecker, transformed the vast, indifferent ocean into a space where fellow men could be as dangerous as any storm or hidden reef. Every distant sail held a dual promise, salvation or ruin, adding an unpredictable and chilling dimension to the already formidable challenges of medieval sea travel. Beyond the tangible dangers of collapsing ships, raging storms, and human predators, the medieval sea voyage exacted a profound and often unseen toll. The mental and emotional strain on those confined within the creaking timbers of a vessel for weeks or months. This psychological burden was frequently amplified by the pervasive superstitions that permeated medieval society, casting a shroud of mystery and dread over the vast, unknowable ocean. At the core of this psychological strain was the deep-seated fear of the unknown. For most medieval individuals, the ocean was not a well-charted, scientifically understood environment. Instead, it was often viewed as a realm of boundless mystery, a place where the familiar laws of the land seemed to dissolve. Stories, passed down through generations, spoke of monstrous creatures lurking in the abyssal depths, colossal serpents, terrifying kraken-like beasts capable of pulling ships into the deep, or mermaids luring sailors to their doom. These were not mere fairy tales, but deeply held beliefs that populated the watery wastes with tangible, terrifying entities. Beyond the monstrous, there was the pervasive belief in divine wrath. Storms were often interpreted as punishments from an angry god, a sign of sin on board, or a direct manifestation of supernatural displeasure. To be lost at sea was not just a navigational failure, it could be seen as being abandoned by Providence, adrift in a cosmic void. Imagine the chilling dread of sailing into a sudden squall, not merely fearing the wind and waves, but believing that the very heavens were turning against you, that your fate was sealed by an unseen, powerful force. This profound sense of the unknown, coupled with a worldview steeped in religious and supernatural interpretations of natural phenomena, made every voyage a journey into an uncertain and often terrifying spiritual landscape. Adding to this existential fear was the relentless physical discomfort of seasickness and general discomfort. For many, the constant debilitating nausea of seasickness was an inescapable reality, rendering even the hardiest individual weak and miserable. The continuous pitching, rolling and yawing of the ship, particularly in rough weather, would induce a profound and unrelenting malaise. Imagine the ceaseless urge to vomit, the spinning head, the clammy skin, the utter inability to find a moment of stillness or relief. This was not a fleeting discomfort, but a persistent, soul-draining affliction that could last for days or even weeks, transforming the simple act of standing or eating into an ordeal. Beyond seasickness, the general discomfort of medieval sea travel was immense. Cramped living quarters, damp and cold conditions, the lack of privacy, the constant stench of bilge water, unwashed bodies, and stale food, the relentless noise of creaking timbers and flapping sails, all contributed to a low-level, yet pervasive, form of suffering. Sleep would be fitful and unrestful, constantly interrupted by the ship's motion or the sounds of the crew. This cumulative physical misery would wear down even the most robust constitution, leaving individuals exhausted, irritable, and vulnerable to despair. The profound sense of isolation and despair was another heavy burden. To be at sea was to be truly cut off from the land, from family, from all that was familiar and comforting. The vast, unbroken horizon emphasized one's insignificance against the immensity of the ocean. Weeks might pass without sight of another vessel or a glimpse of distant land. This isolation could be deeply disorienting, blurring the lines between reality and the anxieties of the mind. If a ship became lost, blown off course, or faced a prolonged period of calm winds, the despair could become overwhelming. The dwindling provisions, the uncertain future, and the crushing realization of being utterly alone in a vast, indifferent world could break even the strongest wills. Imagine the quiet, gnawing fear that would settle in, the slow erosion of hope as days turned into weeks, with no sign of salvation, no way to signal for help, and no guarantee of ever seeing land again. This profound loneliness, coupled with the constant threat of imminent doom, was a silent torment that often haunted the waking hours and permeated the fitful dreams of those at sea. In the face of such overwhelming natural and human perils and the profound psychological strain, it is perhaps unsurprising that religious piety and superstition became deeply intertwined with maritime life. Sailors and passengers alike would often resort to fervent prayer, making vows to saints or deities in exchange for safe passage. Relics, holy symbols, or blessed objects would be carried as talismans, clutched in anxious hands during storms or moments of intense fear, believed to offer divine protection. Imagine the collective desperate prayers offered during a tempest, the whispered promises, the earnest pleas for salvation echoing across the deck. Beyond formal piety, a complex web of superstitions permeated the maritime world. These were often rooted in observation, experience, and a desire to impose some semblance of order or control over the unpredictable elements. Common superstitions included the belief that it was bad luck to have women on board a ship, as they were thought to bring ill fortune or even stir up storms. Similarly, whistling up a storm was a widely held belief, so whistling on deck was often forbidden lest it summon dangerous winds. Certain days were deemed unlucky for setting sail, specific words or actions were avoided, and various rituals were performed to appease the elements or ward off evil spirits. These beliefs, while seemingly irrational to us now, provided a psychological framework for understanding and coping with the immense uncertainties of their world, offering a sense of agency, however illusory, in the face of overwhelming odds. Finally, the power of rumors could significantly heighten anxiety among the crew and passengers. In an age without instant communication, stories, whether factual, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, traveled slowly and often distorted. Tales of monstrous sea creatures, cursed islands that lured ships to their doom, or vengeful spirits of drowned sailors could spread like wildfire through a ship's company. These fearful narratives, shared in hushed tones during the long watches of the night, could feed into existing anxieties and superstitions, creating a collective sense of dread. Imagine the chilling effect of a story recounted by a seasoned sailor, describing a ship that vanished without a trace after encountering a spectral fog, or the hushed warnings about a certain stretch of coast known to be haunted. These rumors, however unsubstantiated, added another layer of unseen psychological peril, turning the vast expanse of the ocean into a canvas for the mind's darkest imaginings. The psychological toll of medieval sea travel was thus a complex tapestry woven from primal fears, physical discomfort, profound isolation, and a rich, often terrifying tapestry of superstition. It was a journey not only across water, but also through the depths of the human mind, challenging the resilience and faith of all who dared to embark upon it. As we conclude our quiet journey across the medieval seas, we arrive at the stark reality that faced every mariner and passenger: the uncertainty of arrival. For those who embarked on a voyage in the Middle Ages, reaching their intended destination was never a foregone conclusion. It was, instead, a triumph against overwhelming odds, a testament to sheer resilience in a world where the elements and human nature conspired against them. It becomes clear, when considering the myriad perils, that it was rarely a single isolated danger that led to disaster. Instead, it was often the cumulative risks that finally overwhelmed a medieval vessel. Imagine a scenario. A ship might depart with a barely discernible small leak, a minor inconvenience initially. Then, a few days into the journey, it encounters an unexpected and violent storm. The constant pounding of the waves, the immense strain on the timbers, might cause that small leak to widen or new breaches to appear. The crew, already exhausted from battling the gale, would now be forced into a ceaseless struggle to bail water, their strength rapidly dwindling. As the storm abates, perhaps the ship finds itself blown far off course, extending the voyage beyond its planned duration. This unforeseen delay leads to dwindling supplies of fresh water and edible food. The crew, already weakened by continuous labor and poor diet, might begin to succumb to scurvy or dysentery from contaminated water. A chance encounter with pirates in their weakened state, or an unexpected patch of fog near an uncharted coast, could then be the final, fatal blow. It was this cruel synergy of factors, one danger compounding another, slowly eroding the ship's integrity and the crew's ability to resist, that most often sealed a vessel's fate. The sobering truth of the medieval maritime world was the uncertainty of arrival. A significant percentage of ships, and tragically, their passengers and crews, simply vanished. They would set sail with hopes and prayers, and then disappear without a trace, swallowed by the vastness of the ocean, leaving no wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. Their stories, untold and unrecorded, became merely grim statistics, silent footnotes in the annals of trade and exploration. Imagine the families left behind, waiting anxiously in port towns, scanning the horizon day after day, their hopes slowly fading into a quiet, resigned despair as weeks turned into months and their loved ones never returned. This constant, unarticulated risk of simply ceasing to exist on the face of the earth was a terrifying undercurrent to every farewell. To brave these waters, to step aboard a fragile vessel and commit oneself to the mercy of the elements and the whims of fate required an immense and profound need for resilience. This was not merely physical strength, though that was undoubtedly essential. It was a resilience of spirit, an enduring courage in the face of constant uncertainty. It was the faith that sustained them through darkest nights and most violent storms, whether faith in a higher power, in the skill of their captain, or simply in the enduring strength of their vessel. And perhaps most importantly, it was sheer endurance. The ability to push past exhaustion, past seasickness, past hunger and thirst, past fear itself, day after grueling day, in the hope of seeing land once more. These were individuals who understood intimately the brutal realities of their world, yet chose, often out of necessity, to confront them head-on. These pervasive dangers profoundly shaped the course of medieval history. They dictated impact on trade and exploration. Long-distance trade routes were often constrained by the perilous nature of sea travel, making land routes, despite their own challenges, a more reliable option for certain goods. Only the most valuable commodities or the most intrepid explorers dared to venture far from known coastal waters. The sheer risks limited the scale and frequency of oceanic voyages, influencing the economic development and interconnectedness of regions. The need to avoid particular storm-prone areas or pirate-infested waters dictated routes, adding significant time and cost to journeys. These dangers also deeply influenced coastal communities. Life in port towns was inextricably linked to the sea. They were places of anxious departures and joyous, or often sorrowful, returns. The rhythms of their lives were often dictated by the arrival or non-arrival of ships, the goods they carried, and the news they brought from distant lands. The sea provided sustenance and opportunity, but it also demanded a constant, terrifying toll. As the gentle sounds of the ocean fade and the long journey of these medieval mariners comes to its contemplative close, let us reflect on their profound experiences. Imagine the quiet courage it took to face those vast, indifferent waters, equipped with only rudimentary tools and an enduring spirit. Their untold stories of silent struggles against unseen forces, of endurance against overwhelming odds, are woven into the very fabric of maritime history. They remind us of the fragility of human endeavor against the immense power of nature, and the remarkable tenacity of the human spirit. And now, as the distant echoes of medieval waves recede, may you too find your own quiet harbor, allowing these distant tales to gently guide you into a peaceful and deep slumber.